the 1800s, we are already beginning to see the division of the North and South in the United States. And what we're going to look at today are some of the reasons why we see that continued division as time goes on in the 1800s. And it kind of all starts with the Industrial Revolution. And what you need to know about the Industrial Revolution is that this is just moving from where people were making goods within their homes instead of it being those very small businesses and these very skilled positions, that it's moving into factories that are, often use machinery. They are powered by steam engines. So we're going to see this shift, and it's going to be more mass production. It is developed in Great Britain first and brought back here to the United States later, where we put this into practice as well. Eli Whitney is going to introduce interchangeable parts, which basically means that you don't have to make something all the way from scratch at the very beginning in order for it to work. So if something breaks, like you can just interchange that part and use it for something else, or just replace that one part instead. Now, mass production is beneficial for consumers because it's going to allow for cheaper goods. When you make something on a large scale, it allows you to make it and produce that good much cheaper, which again is good for consumers. The Lowell factory system is one of the most well-known examples of this early factory system. First of all, it is a modern factory, and it was extremely organized. But one of the things that makes it so unique is that they are going to employ young girls, your early, kind of teenage girls in these factories. And what they did was they would go to farms and they would kind of recruit these young girls and encourage them to come work in these factories. And what we'll see is that they enjoyed this to some extent. However, at times they were definitely taken advantage of. But they had to encourage the families to allow them to do this. And one of the ways they did that was by having a very organized factory system, so that they could say, we're making sure we're taking care of these girls to maintain their integrity. Now, society in the North and the South is very different. Remember, in the North is going to be mostly your owners of industry, so these are going to be your people who are owning these factories, as well as your laborers. So just your average factory worker is going to be here in those factories. Now, because of the type of jobs that most people held in the North, this is where your first labor unions are going to develop. Even right there in that Lowell factory, you will see labor unions develop. And this is also where the anti-slavery movement is going to develop. That abolitionist movement is going to develop there. Many Northerners had already emancipated their slaves, which means they just freed their slaves. The reason they did this was mostly a financial reason. They simply did not have a need for slaves because they're the type of work they did. It was just cheaper to pay a laborer as opposed to owning a slave. In the South, however, we're going to see a much different type of society that was totally based on agriculture. So you're not going to have those trading centers like you had in the North, and your population is much more spread out. At the very top of society in the South was going to be your plantation owners. They are going to be those great big farms with a lot of slaves on those farms, making mostly probably cash crops, which we will talk about. Beneath that were your planters. This is going to be, a farmer on a smaller level, and just kind of your yeoman farmers. So you're going to have different kind of levels of farmers. And it all depended on how many acres of crops they grew, how much, and what they were growing it for. Now, your yeoman farmers, your small farmers, are just going to be growing basically enough for their own families. Slaves were obviously on the very bottom, and we're still considered at this point what we're going to say a necessary evil, meaning that most people acknowledged that slavery was a bad thing and that it needed to be gotten rid of, but that they felt like they just desperately needed it for their economy. But one of the things that I think is a big misconception about the South is that most people believe that, most Southerners owned slaves, when in fact they did not. Most Southerners did not own slaves, which raises the question of why were so many Southerners so desperate to hang on to slaves, because most of them did not own them. And the answer to that is that it's kind of seen as a society symbol, one of those status symbols that, kind of proved to everyone that they were moving on up in rank. So that's one of the things that we're going to see here with slavery in the South. In the South, cotton is king. Now, while cotton becomes the major cash crop in the South, It was a very labor-intensive crop, meaning it took a lot of people and a lot of time to produce this crop. It required a lot of slave labor to keep this crop and to make it profitable. But once again, Eli Whitney comes up with the cotton gin that's going to remove the seeds from cotton, which is going to make the production of this cotton much faster. While it may seem that it would decrease the need for slavery, what it actually does is the opposite of that. It actually increases the capacity for cotton production, but it allows slavery to become much more economically valuable, meaning that now, instead of your large plantation owners owning most of the slaves, now you could have your smaller farmers just own a few slaves and still make a good profit from cotton. So you actually see the cotton gin increase the importance of slavery and increases the number of slaves that are in the South, because now you have more people who own fewer slaves in this case. The views in the North and South were different on almost every issue. Land is the difference between having free land and land based on market value. Obviously, the North would have probably been more interested in that free land to be used for the public good, whereas the South wanted it based on market value. The tariffs, the North wanted a very high tariff to protect American-made products, while the South wanted a low tariff because, once again, they had to buy all of their finished products because they weren't making them. Slavery, obviously, in the North, they did not want slavery and had started to develop moral, ethical, and religious reasons to be against slavery, whereas in the South, they felt like it was economically necessary for them and for their economy to survive. The American system, what begins to happen here in our country is that you have some major leaders like Henry Clay, who's on the top there, and John C. Calhoun on the bottom, who realize that our country is dividing. So they are going to develop something called the American system. The American system was a plan to unite the North and South and to hopefully get them to depend on one another. So there are three parts to the American system. The first is a very high tariff. Again, this one is going to mostly support the North because it's going to encourage people to buy American-made goods and encourage that dependence on one another, the North and South depending on each other as opposed to other places. The second part was to bring back the National Bank. The National Bank's charter had lapsed prior to this point in time, so it's going to bring that National Bank back to be able to handle all of those taxes and everything else that comes about. It's also going to include a system of internal improvements. It's basically trying to create roads, bridges, and canals to make transportation easier and to encourage transportation and trade between our states. Transportation was developed hopefully to connect our the western parts of our country that had just been acquired. Trying to settle those western lands was very important to our government. And this whole plan was promoted by, like I said, those two gentlemen, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, because they saw what was beginning to happen and they were attempting to try to prevent it. Now, transportation, we are going to see the development of the National Road, which was our very first major improved road that was actually constructed by our government. Again, it's going to connect the Ohio and Potomac rivers, so kind of, again, settling westward to encourage that westward settlement. It's going to be created and maintained by the government because most roads at this point in time were going to be those very primitive roads, very rough terrain. And most people traveled on those roads using Conestoga or those big covered wagons like you see in this picture. And that is the main method of overland travel during this time period. We also see an explosion in canal building. The Erie Canal is one of the best examples of this. A canal is just a man-made waterway. And remember, anytime you have the option between land or water, water's going to be your much faster transportation method because you can just go faster. However, canals are eventually going to be replaced by railroads because railroads can go on any terrain in almost any type of weather. So it just makes more sense for there to be more railroads as opposed to canals. So that's what we're going to begin to see as the 1800s move along.